Monster Rancher, a game where you raise pet monsters and then train them and make them fight other people's pet monsters. Where have I seen this formula before? Oh my god! This game is a total ripoff of Twisted Metal, like down to a T, just without the cars and the shooting. It's literally like Twisted Metal. Literally Hitler. Monster Rancher is basically a fighter management simulation game where you don't really fight, you just manage your fighter, or it's not really your fighter. I mean, normally fighter simulation games, like if you're, or sports simulation games, like you're managing a sports team, you're managing a roster of like boxers or MMA fighters, but they all like agree to this. Here you're managing monsters, but they're fighting against their will. None of these monsters actually chose. They don't have the capacity to sign a contract to say we should fight. So literally this is a game about animal abuse. I mean, it has nice music, nice fun childish graphics, and some of the things you do look very happy and kid friendly, but it's literally a game about animal abuse. You can buy the monsters when you go into town from stores, or you can get them from like actual real life CDs. There's different types of monsters, they all have their strengths and weaknesses, but even the monsters that have strengths and weaknesses, you kind of mold them, you train them to be good at specific things. Like you want a monster that's really strong, you train strength, either by sending them off to a training school or just making them perform jobs which train some skills and hurt others. When you make them perform jobs, this also nets you money, so it's literally slavery. You're making them fight, you're making them work for free, and then you're making them live in the stables. It's a game about slavery and animal abuse, but it has nice colorful graphics and nice chipper music, so it's fun for the kids. The game is like an RPG slash management simulation, and the RPG aspects are basically the fact that your monsters level up and train and get better and stronger, and then you also yourself level up by getting higher breeder ranks, being able to participate in more prestigious tournaments with your monsters. The game can be straight up dark. I mean, the monsters you raise can literally die in these tournaments. I have no idea how this game was marketed towards children when there's actual death in it. I know about like some soccer management games that have so many things going on that it's almost impossible to keep up. And for kids, it's definitely impossible to keep up. This game keeps it pretty simple. A lot of the stuff in the management aspects of this game are self-explanatory. For example, you train your monsters, you make them work. When the monster's tired, you give the monster a week to relax and recuperate. You feed the monster. If you give them better food, they train better. If you give them worse food, they don't perform as well. You try to raise their stats, their skills, and all their attributes to make sure they're the best of the best when it's actually time for the meat and potatoes of this game, the tournament where the monsters compete in unarmed combat to the sometimes death. The management aspects of this game are basically like Neopets meets Pokemans. And then the combat aspects, you don't really control your monster when you're fighting, but you do kind of control. I mean, you give the monster commands. Sometimes if the monster doesn't have high enough skills in certain things, they either miss when they hit, when you command them to hit, or they simply like don't listen to you or are confused by your command and don't perform the command. You can tell the monster to move left or right, and this is pretty much the only time you actually control the monster, because when you order the monster to move, he moves right away. The movement isn't that necessary. You can win fights even without moving, but it's helpful just so you get out of the way of enemy attacks and also are in range when it's time for you to hit. The most important thing to keep track of in the fight is the chance of a successful hit, the hit percentage. If it's below 50%, I would back away and wait for it to go up. And when it's like above 60 or 70 or even better, above 90, it's time to spam attacks until that hit percentage goes down again. I very rarely even pay attention to the actual graphics of the fight. All I'm mostly looking at is the hit percentage and the will. Everything else is just kind of secondary or almost not important. The monsters that have similar stats to you, you will beat them by having a smart strategy, but sometimes you just fight a monster that you can't beat even with a smart strategy because the monster will literally like take your whole life off with one or two hits. You can fight the perfect fight. It could be Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez, like the perfect fight. Just fighting like some kind of Super Saiyan ninja, and you will still lose because the enemy will just kill you in a hit. The only way to beat these monsters is basically to go back to your ranch and level up. But how does Monster Rancher compare to other games I've reviewed? Well, let's take a look at a couple of simulation, management, and fighting games and see how it stacks up. Let's compare Monster Rancher to something like Ride Carnival Tycoon. It's a management game where you manage a carnival. I reviewed the game like 4 or 5 years ago. The game was awful. Ride Carnival Tycoon was very plain. You basically just put a bunch of things in an amusement park and watch it. It was like watching, most of the time, from what I remember, a fishbowl. I remember the game also having some glitches, so even though Monster Rancher is almost 10 years older than Ride Carnival Tycoon, I would still say it has better graphics and a lot less glitches. Overall, it's not even a contest. In terms of not even management or simulation games, just being an overall good experience in general, Monster Rancher blows Ride Carnival Tycoon out of the water. But let's compare Monster Rancher to an actual good management simulation game, something like Medieval 2 Total War. Now, Medieval 2 Total War is a game I reviewed about 3 years ago. It's by no means Rome Total War like the first one, not the remake, but it was still a good simulation of like simulating managing your garrison, your armies, and your cities. It was basically managing the entire world or whatever percentage of the world you control. And then it also went into like this combat mode where you fought massive battles with like hundreds or thousands of troops all in one screen. Medieval 2 Total War is definitely better than Monster Rancher just because of how much richer the combat was. I mean, the strategy in the combat in Medieval 2 Total War was insane. So many different troops, so many ways to attack cities, so many ways to have combat in the actual environment if it's just two armies standing in the middle of the field. That game was just like rock, paper, scissors times 50. The strategy was unbelievable. There's definitely strategy in this game. I've talked about it a little, but it's very simplified one-on-one strategy, and this is pretty much a game that children could enjoy and master if you look past the fact that it's animal abuse and slavery. Medieval 2 Total War, that's a game children would only be able to play on the easiest of difficulties, in the easiest of settings. If there's like any kind of complicated fight, I can't see kids being able to handle it. That's a game that really takes some brain juice. The last game I want to compare Monster Rancher to is not really a management game, or not really. It's not a management game at all. It's just a straight up fighting game. And why would I want to compare a management and fighting game to a fighting game? Well, Monster Rancher has fighting. We'll just compare the fighting aspects. Art of Fighting, an absolute classic fighting game for the Sega Genesis from my childhood. It's a game I reviewed, I guess, 3 years ago or so, but it's a game that I've been reviewing in my head since like 1994. I've put so many hours of gameplay into Art of Fighting. It's just an awesome fighting game. The characters are thick. They perform really powerful attacks. It's not as advanced in terms of special moves as something like a Mortal Kombat or a Street Fighter. But in terms of overlooked fighting games, Art of Fighting is one of the games that's definitely been overlooked, and it deserves a lot more praise than it's gotten. The fighting in Art of Fighting is a lot more technical and just a lot better than the fighting in Monster Rancher. Like I said, there's a strategy in Monster Rancher, but it's a very simple strategy, and at some points there is no strategy. Like if you're fighting a monster that straight up hits 2 times or 3 times as hard as you, there's no strategy. It's just impossible to beat that monster. The only way to beat that monster is just to get stronger and better yourself. So the strategy in Monster Rancher compared to the strategy of Art of Fighting is pretty much non-existent. Art of Fighting is like watching Serena Williams play tennis, and Monster Rancher is like Pong. But don't fret, I'm not saying Monster Rancher is a bad game. It's definitely a fun game. It's easy to play. It's like the management game equivalent of Milk and Honey. It doesn't really taste that amazing, but it has some nutrients and it goes down nice and smooth. So it's enjoyable once in a while. This is a game you will enjoy. Not for a long time, not something you'll remember, but it's a fun or a more or less fun experience, and definitely a good introduction into the Monster Rancher franchise. This is, by the way, the first Monster Rancher game ever made. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more classic game reviews. Goodbye, my friends.